Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Thank you all so much. It's good to see everyone. Thank you very much to Jamyang for organizing this. It's really, it's a fantastic event. It's been really nice to listen to all of the talks today so far, and I'm really looking forward to the panel as well this afternoon. So I hope you guys can join us for that. So hello, yes, my name is Erik Jampa Anderson. I'm a Tibetan medicine practitioner from the States, but I live here in London. I'm in Bermondsey. And I have been, as it was said, a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner since I was very young. I felt a really sort of organic and very early and intense draw towards Tibetan Buddhism. I wasn't raised Tibetan Buddhist. I was raised Christian, like most people in my community. But I figured out pretty early on that that wasn't the path that I was supposed to be on. And I did some exploration for actually a few years in my childhood, just looking into different religious traditions, different mythic traditions, neo-paganism and Hinduism and, Catholicism and really everything that I could think of. And eventually when I fell upon Buddhism, it really just felt like coming home. I read some books, and one thing led to another, and books on Zen meditation led to the Namtar of Padmasambhava. And I basically ended up deciding that I was definitely meant to be a Nyingma practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism by the time I was 13. And I announced this to my friends and family with a lot of enthusiasm. And everyone thought that it was, a sort of short little phase and, just a passing interest. And here I am many, many, many years later, not many, 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 but 17 years later, 18 years later, and I'm still doing it. So this has been really the guiding trajectory of my life, has been through the Tibetan sciences. When I left high school and had to decide what to do with my life, I went into performing arts for a little while before realizing that I couldn't separate my professional life and my day-to-day activities from the Dharma. I felt that doing anything other than really absorbing myself in Tibetan sciences and Tibetan Buddhism was sort of a waste of my time. I just didn't feel inspired. I didn't feel enlivened in doing really anything else, even being an artist, which is something that was very important to me and still is important to me. So I left that and started doing Tibetan studies, going a little bit more into the academic side of Tibetology and Buddhist studies, before again falling into this feeling that I wasn't really doing it. I didn't feel that I was directly engaging. I felt that I was looking at something as opposed to really sitting in it. And the opportunity arose for me to study Tibetan medicine. And I had already experienced Tibetan medicine as a patient. I had a sort of severe bout of gastrointestinal issues when I was 20. And as with a lot of people who end up sort of following Tibetan medicine, I had a really miraculous healing experience by seeing a traditional Amchi, Tibetan medicine doctor. And that really convinced me that this was something that wasn't only important and interesting, but really wholly vital for our integration of the Tibetan sciences into the modern world. I really wasn't terribly interested in medicine at that point going into it. It was something that I had grown up with. I grew up with natural medicine and, herbs and supplements and so on. But I wasn't really passionate about medicine necessarily, but I was passionate about Tibetan ways of thinking and Tibetan knowledge. So I decided to enroll in this 4-year, which ended up being 5-year, which ended up being about 8-year program with the Shangsheng Institute, really going through the entire depth of Tibetan medicine, the whole breadth of sort of the foundational teachings and doctrines and texts of the Tibetan medical tradition. And it really changed my life in a rather phenomenal way. Tibetan medicine is an incredible healing modality. It's also an incredibly profound healing modality. And I found it to really represent sort of the scientific arm of my spiritual practice. It was a way to not only try to bridge this seeming divide between science and spirituality, but it showed the way that we've been doing this for thousands of years. Specifically, Tibetan medicine shows an approach that's over 800 years old that involves traditional scientists approaching these various topics pertaining to the human body from a foundational perspective of really profound Buddhist philosophy. And we'll take a look at this today, sort of what Tibetan medicine really is and how it arose, why we have it in the form that we have it today, and what it really has to offer us. I've entitled this talk the Sowa Rigpa Revolution, and I've used this title a few times, and I find it really interesting. It's evocative, but it really speaks to multiple layers of Tibetan medicine's revolutionary sorts of qualities. You know, one is the way that we can incorporate it in our current life circumstances, our current world, as a revolutionary way of thinking. It's really, it gives us a paradigm to shift into and framework to be able to continue, you know, advancing that and growing that through, you know, our perpetual sort of accrual of knowledge, if you will. But then there's also this element of Sowa Rigpa being a revolutionary movement in and of itself. When it arose in Tibet, when it was really codified and set into the textual corpus that we have today, this was also a very revolutionary movement. And the way that Tibetan medicine is manifested and held itself throughout Tibetan history has really been quite revolutionary in a lot of ways. And I really want to share some of that spirit today so that we can gain a little bit more perspective and appreciation and really authentically a sense of awe at the brilliance of traditional scientists throughout the world. So before we properly dive in, let's just take a moment and generate our motivation for being here. And just shut your eyes and really try to feel that heartfelt motivation. This is something that really lives in the heart as a sensorial experience. When we direct our attention to the countless manifestations of sentient beings who are in need of liberation, who are in need of safety and fulfillment and love, nourishment, shelter. And when we really allow ourselves to drop into the heart space of that, you'll even feel a little tug at your heart, a little sensation. Try to just be with that feeling, that openness. Just generating the intention to be here to talk about Sowa Rigpa, to talk about our physiology and ecology for the benefit of all sentient beings. Thank you. So, Buddhism, it can be described in many ways. So this is something that we're all quite familiar with. You've probably encountered, or you may be yourself, you know, the kinds of folks that say that Buddhism is fundamentally not a religion, that it's a philosophy, or it's a way of life, or it's a psychology, or it's a, you know, a life science, or an inner science. There's many, many different ways that we can classify Buddhism. To classify it as any one of those things would, however, be quite reductive. In reality, Buddhism is a psychology, it is a science, it is a religion, it is a spirituality, it is a mythic tradition, it is a cultural tradition, an intercultural tradition. It's all of these things at once. It holds a lot of roles. And one of the roles that are really embedded into the fundamental sort of mythos of Buddhism is that Buddhism is medicine. The first teaching that most of us encounter when we come to Buddhism is the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So we know these, we know there's the truth of suffering, recognizing that the sort of basic affliction that faces us is this experience of suffering. So that's the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, which identifies that clinging, attachment, desire, that these are really foundational ideological factors, if you were, for the experience of suffering. the truth of the cessation, which shows us that there is a way out of suffering, and then the truth of the path, which presents us with the Eightfold Path and this path to get out of the experience of suffering. This sort of paradigmatic tool is something that already existed in the Buddha's time. It was already used by a number of individuals in certain professions and worlds, but not necessarily in spirituality. It was something that could be more readily found in medicine. And we still have this paradigm today. We still have the breakdown of diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, and treatment. These are the four essential features of medicine even now. So the Buddha was really acting as a kind of physician, but instead of just acting to heal human diseases, to heal, colds and flus or viral, epidemics or cancers and so on, he primarily directed his sort of physician role towards the alleviation of our most fundamental and most insidious disease, which is suffering. This suffering manifests with many different kinds of symptoms. My kind of suffering is necessarily going to be quite distinct from your kind of suffering. My symptoms are different from your symptoms, but the underlying diagnosis remains the same, not only for humans, but for all sentient beings, which, as we'll discuss today, is really genuinely a lot broader than we usually allow ourselves to conceive of. So if this is the fundamental disease, then he presents us with not only a way to get out of it, but also a deep understanding of why it arises in the first place. We have an understanding of clinging, of desire and attachment, addiction, if you will, as a fundamental etiological factor. And he also explains the many other, mental afflictions and sort of encumbered states that lead us to this disease of suffering. So that's within the etiology. His prognosis is quite positive. It's positive, but it's complex, because he basically tells us, yes, we can heal your chronic case of suffering. However, the circumstances have to be very perfect, and you need to really apply yourself, because the treatment is a doozy. It's really going to require a lot from you, and you have to dedicate yourself to it. So with that in mind, we have these two options. We have, do we cure our, terminal chronic disease? Or do we just sort of, let it go by because it's easier? And if you choose to take the treatment path, if you choose to step onto that road and to lead yourself towards the alleviation of your chronic suffering, then you need to follow the Noble Eightfold Path. So when we think of it in this way, and this isn't like a modern sort of, reconception of the Buddha's teachings. This is a paradigm that existed in ancient India at the time that the Buddha was teaching. He also had in his court doctors. Jivaka Kumara is the famous, physician of the Buddha. And, he also is the father of the Thai medical tradition. He's recognized as a figure in Ayurveda. He was a medical lineage holder that the Buddha had direct access to. So we can really think of Buddhism fundamentally as being entirely in line with the medical sort of mentality of looking at the problem in front of us, diagnosing what the real issue is, finding out what leads to that in the first place, and then trying to remedy that, trying to, either prevent further disease and heal what exists. So in that way, we can think of Buddhism as medicine. Tibetan Buddhism, or Tibetan medicine, however, is quite distinctly not Buddhist medicine. This is a bit of a misunderstanding about Tibetan medicine, and it's actually rooted in a fundamental, what we would call like a charter myth about Tibetan medicine. So when you look at Tibetan medicine, if you look at the texts themselves, they'll tell you that the medicine Buddha taught Tibetan medicine, 2,500 years ago in the healing gardens of Tanaduk, and that this was essentially a chapter of the historical Buddha's life, that he self-manifested as the blue medicine Buddha, assembled an entourage of different disciples to teach to, and then they sort of held this in a tight lineage until it came to Tibet. The reality is actually even more impressive and more shocking and more, I think, as a Buddhist, inspiring, especially inspiring, considering the way that we sometimes perceive ancient streams of knowledge in humanity. The Tibetan medical example is actually a really fundamental exception to that sort of diluted idea. So with Tibetan medicine, in the early wave of Buddhism in Tibet during the imperial era, which went from about the 7th to the 9th century of the Common Era. So this is when we have, King Songtsen Gampo, we have Trisong Detsen, we have Relpa Chen, we have the great Dharma kings of Tibet. These were the ones that originally invited Buddhist teachers from India, Padmasambhava from Odayana, but by way of India. And this was the first spread of the Buddhist teachings in Tibet. This was actually, this was a very expansive time in Tibetan history. Tibet had existed in some form for a very long time, but it wasn't a unified empire. It was many different kingdoms, many different communities and cultures that were intermixing and communicating with one another, but they each had their own distinct characteristics and traditions, as well as their own interactions with other cultures over the years. But the imperial era, the age of the Tibetan Empire, was a time of a massive amount of intercultural dialogue. There were envoys being sent between Tibet and China. There were teachings being brought in from India. There were further developments that were beginning to take place via connections along the Silk Roads. There was a really, cosmopolitan atmosphere in the Tibetan imperial age. And in this time, there were also a lot of medical teachings that came to Tibet. Tibet already had its own ancestral healing traditions, many different forms, a lot of knowledge, especially relating to things like physical trauma. The Tibetan traumatology sort of science is considered to be one of the most advanced in the ancient world. And it's thought that part of this is just because of the lifestyle of living in a rather sometimes violent Himalayan atmosphere. So they had all of these medical traditions coming to Tibet that included not only Indian works and Chinese works, but also works from the ancient Greco-Arabic world. There were works that were connected to figures like Galen, Galenos, and other masters that were from not only the Western classical sort of European world, but also the Arabic healing tradition, the Arabic medical world, which was itself this amazing cosmopolitan nexus of different intellectual disciplines coming together. So all of these came to Tibet in some form during the imperial age. By the fall of the Tibetan Empire and what began the period that's called the era of dissolution, this was the dissolution of the Tibetan Empire. During this time, there were still medical developments, there were still lineages, there were still communications taking place. And there were really important sort of focal points, especially along the Silk Roads, that involved this transfer of knowledge. Sometimes when we think of the Silk Roads, we think of like, maybe, turban bearing, Arabic traders that start in Venice and then end in China. We think of it as one long road in which people start over here and end over here. But that's actually not what the Silk Roads were. It also wasn't one road. It's not the Silk Road. It's the Silk Roads network. And there were many different paths and channels of communication that existed across Eurasia for really the majority of the time that we've had advanced cultures and civilizations here. And interactions took place all along that network. From one village here and one village here, there was connection. Then from this village here and this village here, there was connection. And this village and this metropolis, there was connection. So these communications took place consistently throughout, what we would consider to be even sort of the dark ages of humanity. So within this, there was a really sort of vital propensity for knowledge to be held, maintained, translated, shared, and developed in a transcultural sort of environment. Then we come to what's known as the second wave of Buddhism in Tibet. So this is also considered to be like the Tibetan Renaissance. This was following the era of fragmentation. This was a time when new Dharma texts were coming to India, or coming to Tibet from India. New medical literature was coming to Tibet from India. The Tantras started to emerge in Tibet, works like the Kala Chakra Tantra and the Chakra Samvara Tantra. These first came to Tibet during this era, during this Renaissance. So this was genuinely a renaissance. This was a society that already had its own medical, its own scientific, its own religious systems. Buddhism had dealt a bit of a blow, was dealt a bit of a blow in the preceding centuries, but it still persisted. It was still there. But these were phenomenally, gifted and talented and intellectually sharp people, as all Homo sapiens fundamentally are. And they already had these systems for being able to identify and analyze reality in a very sophisticated way. They then got this influx of brand new materials, brand new knowledge, brand new medical and scientific literature. Among these was a work that's known as the Ashtanga Shrīdaya Samhita. And if anyone here has studied Ayurveda, then you'll probably be very familiar with this. It's one of the most important and famous works of Ayurvedic medicine, along with the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, and a number of other more sort of auxiliary works. So this Ashtanga Shrīdaya Samhita is a work of Ayurvedic medicine. It speaks to us about many things, including sort of the basic anatomy and physiology of the human body. And it was very distinctly affected by Buddhist philosophy. Ayurveda as a whole, as we know it today, was influenced by Buddhism. It's not the pre-Buddhist medical tradition. There was pre-Buddhist medicine in India, of course, but what we know today as Ayurveda was actually very distinctly influenced by Buddhist philosophy. So when this came to Tibet, it brought this whole incredible scientific paradigm of Ayurveda and the three humors and a really sophisticated understanding of how the human body operates. But they also already had circulating in Tibet, at least within oral lineages and people's personal practice lineages, this information from the Greco-Arabic world and the Chinese world and the Mongolian world, and ultimately ancestral Tibetan medical tradition. So in the 12th century, in the midst of the Tibetan cultural renaissance, there was a great master that was born in Tibet, and his name was Yuthok Yönten Gönpo. So Yuthok Yönten Gönpo, he's our lovely gentleman that I have hanging behind me here, and I'll bring up a picture of him in a little bit as well. He is the father of Tibetan medicine. He lived in the 12th century, and he was a very real historical figure. There's no question, there's no ambiguity. He was a real historical figure who actually wrote himself and who had close disciples who could, corroborate his existence. We're not always gifted with these sorts of, historical facts when it comes to Buddhist Buddhist historical figures. A lot of times we do, but sometimes we don't. But Yuthok is certainly a very real figure. And he was a genius. He was a savant. He was the very definition of a Renaissance man in ancient Tibet. And he spent many decades of his life traveling. He was born into a family lineage of doctors that received this amazing Ashtanga Shrīdaya Samhita lineage. But for him, it wasn't the whole story. He knew that there was more. He knew that even in the Tibetan tradition, that there was a long history of really bringing in many different disciplines into one place to synthesize them into a fully robust and all-encompassing healing tradition. So he spent decades traveling. He went to India, he went to Nepal, he went west to the Greco-Arabic world, the Persian world, and he encountered a lot of different medical teachings from a lot of different sources. He then came back to Tibet, and he spent the rest of his life composing what are now known as the Four Tantras, or the gyushi of Tibetan medicine. I have a few of those right here, which were published by Mensikang, a really incredible translation effort on their part to make these available. And these have served as the primary teaching textbooks, as the primary theoretical texts of Tibetan medicine since Yuthok's era. There's been really no interruption of this. He originally only taught it to one disciple, but then this disciple disseminated it and really helped to establish it as the standard for medicine in Tibet. When we look through the gyushi, we'll see the mythical story about how the medicine Buddha taught the gyushi in its entirety 2,500 years ago in India. But we really know that this was an attempt on Yuthok's part to make us appreciate the profundity and the importance of medicine in Tibet. He did infuse it with Buddhist philosophy, but this is because he himself was a Buddhist philosopher. He, as a scientist, approached the topic of medicine from the standpoint of Buddhism. And what resulted, the Tibetan medical tradition, is the direct result of that approach. It's the direct result of that natural synthesis. So when we say that Tibetan medicine is a Buddhist form of medicine, it doesn't mean that it comes from Buddhism. It means that this is the result of what happened when a very advanced and profound and really enlightened master of Buddhism looked at medicine and made it the goal of his life to create a medical system that works for everyone. So that's really how we get Tibetan medicine. That's where it comes from. This lineage, of course, like all Tibetan lineages, had its own period of development, and we actually owe this persistence of this lineage to the fifth Dalai Lama and his regent Sangye Gyatso, Desi Sangye Gyatso. These were other Renaissance men, that existed in another Tibetan Renaissance of the early modern era, and you can actually read about their story in a really brilliant book by Janet Gyatso called "Being Human in a Buddhist World." It's Being Human in a Buddhist World. Cannot recommend that enough. If any of this is interesting to you, if the development of knowledge in the ancient world and in Tibet interests you, then I would really recommend checking this out. But especially this reign of the fifth Dalai Lama and his regent, these were really instrumental for founding Chakbori University, which was the first Tibetan medical institute university in the world, and really establishing the Gyushi and Yuthok's approach as the official approach of Tibetan medicine into the current age. So that's just a little bit of historical context. I could talk about the history of Tibetan medicine for days and days and days and days, but I will avoid that impulse and try to move on. Yuthok was also, though, I do want to point out that he wasn't just a medical master. He wasn't just a scientist. He was distinctly a scientist. And as we can see in his works, we can even sort of parse out the different sections of his text and where he got the information from. We can see the process of synthesis that took place for him, the way that he compared an ancient Tibetan text that was translated maybe from a sort of Middle Persian or from originally a Greek language, and the way that he matched that to a Chinese text, and the way that he infused that with Ayurvedic philosophy. It was really the work of a genius. We should think of him as someone like Da Vinci or Newton, as opposed to just thinking of him as a meditation master. But importantly, he was also that. He held a spiritual tradition. He was a yogi. He was he's believed to be an enlightened master, and he also left behind a series of spiritual instructions. These are known as the Yuthok Nyingtik, or the heart essence of Yuthok. This is classified in the Nyingma tradition as a terma, or a rediscovered treasure, but it was discovered by Yuthok. However, even though it's a terma, it's also identified as being distinctly non-sectarian. The fifth Dalai Lama practiced the Yuthok Nyingtik, Nyingma masters practiced the Yuthok Nyingtik, Karma-Kagyu masters practiced the Yuthok Nyingtik, Sakyapas practiced the Yuthok Nyingtik, Jonangpas practiced the Yuthok Nyingtik. Everyone is open to this practice because it's fundamentally rooted in this very egalitarian and sort of non-sectarian approach to spirituality, which is very medical in orientation. So if you're interested in this, I'll post a link at the end to my website, and there's some events coming up if you're interested in Yuthok Nyingtik, but there's a lot of resources out there that are available to you. Okay, so the Four Tantras, this medical textbook and Tibetan medical philosophy as a whole, approaches the human body on a few different levels. So we're really sort of familiar with this paradigm of body, mind, and spirit. This is something that we, can sort of conceptualize and that we talk about, and it's found its way into sort of modern parlance. Tibetan medicine also has a similar sort of breakdown, but instead of thinking of body, mind, and spirit, we can think of body, mind, and energy. And we can also think of ecology as being a really intrinsic element to the Tibetan medical worldview. And I'll break these down for us in the course of our workshop today. Really, the fundamental principle that you have to understand when we approach traditional sciences across Eurasia and realistically across the entire world, but we really see this across Eurasia in particular, is the concept of the 5 elements. And I want to point out something that sometimes eludes us or evades us, is this recognition that when we see something like the 5 elements echoed in so many different ancient cultures, we can sort of approach that from 2 directions. We can think, oh, it's amazing that humanity in many different places was able to organically come up with the same realizations. Or we can approach it from the perspective of, oh, there must have been some sort of an interchange and a sharing of ideas in the ancient world. While the former is certainly true in some respects, it's really the latter that we should allow to seep into our minds, to remember that this idea of monocultures that were isolated in the ancient world and that had their own independent existence is very, very reductive and not very historically valid. really these are places of cultural contact. They're zones of culture, and these shift constantly throughout history. So areas that we might now think of as being, like Dunhuang, which is, a part of the Silk Roads network, and we think of it, usually as a part of China. And for a certain period of Tibetan history, it was a proper part of the Tibetan Empire. Really, actually, around the time that the caves were sealed up, was when Tibetan rule was still very much felt, and people were using Tibetan as a colloquial language. But this is a place that we don't really think of as being Tibetan necessarily. This is a part of, the deserty stretch along the Silk Roads going into China. But really, these cultural zones were shifting constantly throughout history, and they continue to shift in our modern era. And information like the 5 elements, concepts like the 3 humors, these were things that did travel great distances across the ancient world. And there's a reason that we can find similar principles in ancient Greek culture as we find in ancient Indian culture. There were connections between them. If you go to the V&A and you check out the Gandharan statues of the Buddha, who looks like, a Greek gentleman or a Greek god, then, you can really see how these areas of cultural interaction were operating for a very long time and in very significant ways. So the 5 elements, and I am now going to go over to a whiteboard so that I can show this. Okay, so this is Yuthok. This is Yuthok Yönten Gönpo. I won't talk a lot about this image, but there's a lot that could be said. This sort of gives you a nice picture of where Yuthok's lineage fits into the sort of broader trajectory of Tibetan medicine. But we'll leave that aside. So this is a sort of very common and very beautiful depiction of Yuthok, Yuthok the Younger. So there are 5 elements that we find in classical Indian cosmology, and they're present right here. We have the space element, we have the air element, the fire element, the water element, and the earth element. These are familiar to probably all of us, if for no other reason than maybe in sort of the mandala, the concept of the mandala and the 5 Buddha families. These 5 Buddha families obviously correlate with these 5 elements. This is actually something it's interesting to look at because this relates with a Buddhist, actually an Indian cosmological principle, which surrounds the development of the phenomenal world. And with that, we have the space element as sort of that which persists between the destruction of a universe system and the creation of a new universe system. This space element is itself imperceptible. It doesn't have distinct sort of characteristics, but it holds the sort of seeds of the other 5 elements. From this space element, we have the air element of motility, which arises. So this is like the movement that arises from the Big Bang, or as some modern scientists are sort of talking about it, it's that movement away from this quantum energy wave into the point that actually precipitated the emergence of physical matter. So this is an expansive sort of force. It's motility, it's movement. This is rLung in Tibetan. And this rLung is something that we use this term for everything. We use this for breath. We use this for the sort of inner prana energy. We use this for actual literal wind. We use this for oxygen. We use this for the fundamental element of air. It's a very multivalent term. But here we can think of it as fundamentally this motility factor in the universe. Once that motility factor started getting things going, it produced heat. It produced this experience of temperature, this quality of temperature. Even the experience of cold, being cold is a function of heat because you have to be warmer than the outer perception in order for you to feel cold. For one thing to experience something as cold, it has to be warmer. So even coldness is a function of heat. So this is the fire element, which arises in many different ways as this sort of fire or sort of heat principle throughout the universe. The union of these qualities and other circumstances lead to the development of moisture. This moisture is the water element, and it's again something that pervades the entire universe. We know that at some point there was liquid water on our nearest planets, or on some planets, and there may be existent liquid water in many other places. So this idea of liquidity or fluidity is something that's really intrinsic to the water element. And then the last element that arose in this whole sort of cosmic display is the earth element. And this is solidity. This is the hard mass of matter. When you see these 5 elements displayed like this, it should be a bit evocative. It probably reminds you of something. This is one of the sort of explanations for a stupa. This is one of the ways that we can understand the architecture of a stupa is as the representation of these 5 elements. In Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and cosmology, everything is composed of the 5 elements. Physical matter, our mental states, our emotional experiences, our enlightened wisdom states are connected in some way to these 5 elemental forces. And also our physiology is fundamentally impacted by these 5 forces. So when we look at how they manifest in the Tibetan tradition, the space element is seen as the underlying sort of matrix from which all of the other elements arise. The water and earth element combine to form peken, which is the phlegmatic humor that we would know as kapha in Ayurveda. Tipa arises from the fire element. So this is what we would know as pitta in Ayurveda, which is the bile humor. And then lung, or wind, arises from the air element, which we would know as the vata dosha in the Ayurvedic tradition. These are connected. These traditions are connected. They are attempting to speak about the same thing. However, because Tibetan medicine is a syncretic tradition that attempted to bridge the gap between many different medical lineages, there's a slightly distinct understanding of these 3 humors in Tibetan medicine from what you would find in Ayurveda. But the differences are microscopic. And really, we should consider them to be a part of the same medical family. So these humors are present in all of our bodies at all times. Our physiological processes are fundamentally motivated and activated by these 3 humors. So when we think about, things like peristalsis, food moving down the digestive system, when we think of urination or defecation, when we think of breathing, respiration, when we think of circulation throughout the body, these are all functions of the lung humor, the lung nyepa, which is this motility factor as presented in our physiological organism. When we have metabolic heat, when we have that fire that helps to break down our food and synthesize it into the nutrients that are necessary for our survival, that's a function of the pitta humor, of the tipa nyepa, which is this heat manifestation in the body. Our metabolic fire is very distinctly connected to this. When we think about the solidity and the stability of our body, when we think of the actual corporeal mass that forms as our flesh, these are all considered to be elements of peken, of this phlegmatic humor, which, as well as being watery, is also earthy. It's also solid. It provides stability. In addition, we can see that the fluids of our body and the mucosal membranes of our body, these are also really sort of governed by this peken humor. So without these 3 humors, we would be in a lot of trouble. we would not have functioning physiological systems. We wouldn't be able to breathe. We wouldn't be able to circulate blood through the body. We wouldn't be able to speak. We wouldn't be able to access memory in a significant way. All of these are considered to be functions of these 3 humors. Each of these humors have their own myriad manifestations. Lung has 5 sort of principal humors and 5 branch humors. There's 5 tipa energies and 5 peken energies. And to really understand Tibetan medicine is to understand the way that these humors constantly work in a sort of interconnected, in tandem in our body in order to sustain our physiology, in order to sustain our organism. So that's the humoral theory. However, since these 5 elements are present in our physiological system, and they're also present in all other manifestations of phenomena, then our food, our behaviors, the medicines and herbs that we take into our body, the external therapies that we engage with, are also introducing their own balance of the 5 elements in very distinct ways. And when that's done skillfully and, sort of intelligently, then we can help to elevate the experience of health in our body and experience a state of balance. But if we take in a massive amount of earth and water element, and if we're already very earthy and watery, we still already have a phlegmatic constitution, then we're going to aggravate certain imbalances in our body. And that's when the experience of disease arises. There's considered to be 3 root causes of disease. And these 3 root causes are one of the very distinct bits of input from the Buddhist tradition. So Yuthok, as opposed to Ayurveda, which doesn't flesh this concept out in the same way, Tibetan medicine posits that the 3 humoral energies, so we have, I'll use my little pointer. So we have Tipa over here, we have Lung over here, and we have Pekan over here. Those are fundamentally rooted. Imbalance of those humors are fundamentally rooted in our experience of unawareness. Unawareness in Tibetan is Ma Rigpa. So if Rigpa is awareness, Ma Rigpa is the negation of awareness. It's the lack of awareness. This is our fundamental delusion to the state of our being, to the state of our existence. This Ma Rigpa causes us to be rather confused, and it causes us to divide ourselves from phenomenal appearances. We experience ourselves through this fundamental split from the ground of being, from between self and other. It's this fundamental sense of alienation based on delusion. This delusion, this ignorance, this fundamental ignorance then manifests in many different forms. And we know these as our afflictive mental states, as our kleshas. We might specifically know these as the three poisons or the 5 poisons. And these can be found right here as aversion, delusion, and addiction. I am choosing to translate this as addiction. It's an imperfect translation, but I feel it does a better job of uniting the experiences of desire and attachment, which are often used in place of this term. Addiction really brings us into the fundamental sense of wanting something and not wanting to let go of it and wanting more of it. These 3 afflictive mental states are the most fundamental kleshas, the most fundamental poisons in the experience of our minds. And these poisons, by extension, then impact our physiological system in very specific ways. If we have a lot of addictive tendencies or a lot of desire, a lot of attachment, then we're leading to an increase in lung in our physiological expression. And when I say physiology from a Tibetan medicine perspective, psychology is intrinsic to that. Our physiological and psychological systems aren't actually distinct, like really separated in traditional medicine. It's understood that when lung becomes aggravated in your body, you will necessarily experience physical sensations and you'll experience psychological and emotional experiences. These will all be part of the sort of matrix of a disease state. Some things have more psychological components and less physiological components, and others are the other way around, but they're really quite distinctly interconnected. So this lung ultimately gives rise to anxiety. And this is the primary psychological sort of stress response that you find in people that have imbalanced lung. Aversion gives rise to Tipa imbalances, which helps to create this sense of anger. And it was interesting in Paula's talk and in the meditation on the organ systems, which I'll come back to in a second as well, because it relates to Tibetan medicine. But we saw that the liver, for instance, is the seat of anger, that we have anger sort of living in the liver in a certain sense, or that the liver is governing over it, that it acts as a sort of official over this experience of anger. And this is also tied to this Tipa energy, which also really lives in the liver and gallbladder. So because of this connection with the liver and with Tipa and bile and anger, if we have a lot of aversion and this gives rise to Tipa, then we will experience frustration and anger in our psychological equilibrium or lack thereof. The other option is delusion. So if you don't have aversion and you don't have attachment, if you don't want to bring something close and you don't want to push it away, you're sort of stuck in this, I don't really care, I'm a bit tired, I just want to, shut my eyes and escape. That's this experience of delusion. This dimuk in Tibetan, which really, we sometimes say that it's, ignorance, but it's not that fundamental profound ignorance. It's the sort of stupor of stupidity. It's the stupor of delusion. That's the way that I like to talk about it. So when we fall into those states of stupor, and when we fall into that sort of heaviness of delusion, this increases the phlegmatic humor in the body, this peken energy. This affects our physiology, but then psychologically, we experience this sort of stress as depression. So it's very common if someone has a predominantly phlegmatic constitution, if someone has a very lungy constitution or a more bilious constitution, they will usually have these specific mental experiences as their sort of out when they get stressed. If things get really hectic and they have a lot, they're trying to hold a lot and they have a bit of emotional, sort of struggle that's tying into it, they'll usually try to escape that or express it through one of these emotional states. So this is how we can sort of relate with the experience of stress in a very individualized and nuanced way. I think it's important to understand about Tibetan medicine and about traditional medicine as a whole, that they were highly individualized. Treatment for any illness, any disease is necessarily going to look different for one patient who has a very phlegmatic constitution versus for someone else who has more of a lung tipa constitution, a bit of a mix between these two. You would treat them differently, even if they both have the fundamental sort of same diagnosis according to modern biomedicine. So in this way, it's a much more nuanced and more, I think, sophisticated approach to medicine. And it's one that we're actually coming to in the modern era. We're recognizing that actually medicine needs to be individualized. We need to look at people's individual constitutions, at their genetic profile, at their diets and behavior in order to be able to determine what the best treatment would be for them. So, God, time's going so quickly. So sorry for just talking at you guys a lot, but I hope it's interesting. Something else I want to point out is about those 5 organ systems that really come from the Chinese medical tradition. Those are also found in Tibetan medicine. Tibetan medicine, quite interestingly, doesn't just use the 5 inner elements of the Indian philosophical and cosmological paradigm. They also use the Chinese 5 elements, the Sino-Tibetan 5 elements, as I call them, because we can't really identify where they started, but we know that they pervade both the Chinese and the Tibetan worlds. This is where we get the metal element and the wood element, which feature very heavily in Tibetan astrology and also in certain elements of Tibetan medicine. And this represents or sort of illustrates how incredible Yuthok's project was in trying to take even different elemental systems, where one has space and wind and the other has metal and wood, and trying to fit them together and find the commonalities, and also honor the discrepancies and present them with their own integrity. So those 5 organ systems are also present in the Tibetan medical tradition. They represent more of our sort of anatomy as opposed to our physiology. The 3 humors move through and interact with the 5 organ systems in various ways in order to maintain our homeostasis. So once we've established that this is how sort of disease arises on a very fundamental and sort of profound level, we obviously are left with the lived experience of knowing that, okay, well, but I got sick and it wasn't just because I had a lot of desire or I had a lot of anger or I had a lot of ignorance. There were other factors that led to my disorder. And this is also obviously, recognized in Tibetan medicine. These are called the 3 causes of disease, the 3 distant causes. But then we have the 4 immediate conditions, the 4 more sort of present conditions, conditioning factors that lead to the emergence of disease. These are diet, behavior, season and time, and provocation. These 4 factors are the things that we engage with in our day-to-day lives, and they activate the underlying propensity for imbalance that is within all of us. It's taught in Buddhism that once you attain full enlightenment, then your 3 humors are no longer going to be naturally afflictive because your 3 mental poisons have been completely sort of satiated and transformed. This is why we say, for instance, that the Buddha demonstrated impermanence at the moment of his death, and not that he died. Not that he died of a poison mushroom or a poisoned piece of pork or something like that. We say that he demonstrated impermanence for the benefit of sentient beings. And the reason for this, the sort of, traditional scientific rationale is that his poisons, his 3 poisons, were no longer there. His humors were still functioning, but in a fully balanced way. But when he chose to express imbalance, when he chose to demonstrate illness or death, then that moment took place. Whether you perceive this as being, actually historically and scientifically the way things work is one thing, but we can certainly see that these disordered mental states, that these afflictive imbalances on our psychological level do have a direct impact on our physiological body. And as an extension of that, we'll also have a manifestation in our psychological well-being. We'll experience things like frustration and anger and stress and anxiety and depression and so on. These are part of this humoral and elemental sort of scheme. So with these 4 causes, the 4 conditions of illness, we know that diet is obviously a direct impact on our physical health. We are literally what we eat. The physical cells of our body, the atoms of our body, are literally metabolized and synthesized from the food that we're bringing into our body. So this is essential. And this is consistent across the ancient world. We have the Hippocratic maxim of, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. We have concepts of dietetics in ancient India. We have this in Tibet, in China. We have this in non-Eurasian, cultures and civilizations. There was always an understanding that what we eat has an impact on our physical health and on our mental health and emotional health. Behavior covers quite a broad spectrum of different activities that can be both conducive to good health and also very destructive to our health. We heard Paula talk about rest as a really important and essential component of our physical well-being. And this is certainly, a part of the Tibetan medical tradition as well. Very commonly, Tibetan medicine doctors have to tell their patients, okay, you need to stop doing so much. You need to find time to actually rest and regenerate and recharge. This is a part of the system intrinsically. But there's many other kinds of behaviors. We have things like yoga. We have things like, addictive use of various substances. We have, addictive and destructive physical behaviors. We have exercise or the lack thereof. Behavior is really important when we consider our physical health and our mental health. But then we get into somewhat more sort of esoteric, categories here. It's not truly esoteric in a sort of Vajrayana sense, but it's a little more esoteric in that we're not so familiar with it and thinking about these as being real factors of health in modern biomedicine. Season and time is something that's gained a bit of traction in the past few years. So someone received a Nobel Prize a few years ago for coming up with this system for sort of mapping the human body and our physiological processes on a 24-hour clock and looking at the way that the rotation of the earth ultimately impacts our physiological processes. And this was seen as a phenomenal Nobel Prize deserving realization. But if you look in virtually any traditional medical system, you'll see very similar ideas. Ayurveda and Chinese medicine and Tibetan medicine and the ancient Greco-Arabic traditions being the best examples of these. But seasons and time do directly impact our physical health. There's a reason that we have more instances of things like pneumonia in the fall. There's a reason that we can perceive and conceive of cold and flu season as being an actual thing. The shift in seasons, the shift in our outer sort of cosmological orientation, the outer circumstances of our world have a direct impact on our bodies. And this is true on a seasonal level and also on a daily level. We go through different periods of certain humors being activated and then certain humors being pacified throughout the cycle of the day. The last one here is what I really want to spend the rest of our time talking about, even though I want to talk about rLung, and I will a little bit, but I really want to focus on this topic of provocation. Provocation is essentially, this is dun in Tibetan. So dun is essentially understood as outer forces, outer provocative forces that can impact our health. These are outer agents, fundamentally. They're not things that we bring into our body with our diet. It's not our own personal behavior. It's not the rigid sort of cyclical nature of the outer seasons and the 24-hour cycle. This is something else. we most frequently encounter this in Tibetan medicine as spirit-borne illnesses or spirit illnesses. However, when we look at really the sort of deeper teachings and more scientific orientation of Tibetan medicine in particular, we're also talking about microorganisms. We're talking about viruses. We're talking about bacteria. We're also talking about the way that we relate with outer beings in our atmosphere, in our environment, who may be able to have some sort of an impact on our physiological bodies. Before I go into provocation properly, I do want to point out that along with this fourfold template for the causes of disease, so we have diet, behavior, season or time, and then provocation, we also have the four remedial measures or the four treatments. Those four treatment methods in Tibetan medicine are diet, behavior. So this shouldn't be a surprise. These are important elements of both what makes us sick and also what gets us well. So those are also employed in the therapeutic sense. And then we have medicines, which are primarily herbal, but also they contain mineral substances, animal substances, organic and inorganic compounds. They're much more complex than just herbal medicines, but they are medicines. And then we have external therapies. So these are the four main treatment modalities that are used in Tibetan medicine. We'll usually, if you go to see a Tibetan doctor, we'll give you a dietary sort of plan, different dietary advice that you can follow. We might recommend some behavior, maybe some prostrations, maybe some, physical yoga, some lujong. Maybe we might tell you to stop smoking or drinking. We might tell you to, exercise more. There's many things that can come with that. And then we might also provide herbal medicines. You might be familiar with the little Tibetan pills or decoctions, infusions, and so on. And then external therapies like moxibustion, acupuncture, and even bloodletting traditionally is a very important element actually of external therapies. So that sort of gets out of the way, like what Tibetan medicine has. It's much, much, much more than an energy healing modality. We don't use singing bowls. We don't just use meditation techniques or visualization or, breathing exercises. Those are important and essential components of the therapeutic journey. Not the singing bowls and things, but the meditation and the visualization, yoga, and so on. But the main thing that we're doing is working with internal medicine. We're understanding, okay, which systems of the body are improperly functioning, are imbalanced. What are the various systems within the body that are implicated in that imbalance? Why did it become imbalanced in the first place? And how can we restore the body and mind back to a state of balance? That's really the activity of the Tibetan doctor and of Tibetan medicine. One thing that I will point out actually that is quite helpful is this, which are the 5 rLung energies. I use this term energies in place of humors just sort of out of convention, but I actually personally really like using the term humor. It has a long history in the Western tradition of speaking to these various kinds of energies within the body that need to be kept in a state of balance. Galenic medicine treated humors very, very differently. They were viewed as fluids in the body that had to be kept in balance against one another. And this isn't what we identify as humors in the Ayurvedic or Chinese or Tibetan medical traditions. But regardless, there was some back and forth there. There's a reason why the Greco-Arabic humors look very similar to elements of the Sino-Tibetan and Indo-Tibetan traditions. But these rLung energies, these are what precipitate movement in our body. This is what controls motility through our physiological system. We have the Songzin rLung, the life-supporting wind or life-sustaining wind that sits in the crown chakra and it moves down into the chest. So this is responsible for a lot of things. It's responsible for elements of our memory and cognitive function. It's related with neural activity. It's related with swallowing. There's many different things that this Songzin rLung, this life-holding wind, the wind that holds our life, is responsible for. This rLung has also been related to the heart in various ways. You find this in yogic traditions, that it's more related to the heart sometimes. And this is really more of a function of the neural activity relating to the heart, the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic nervous system. When we have this activated, our Songzhen Lung is acting in a healthy way. It's in a state of balance. We also have the ascending wind, the ascending lung, which moves things up and out of our body. It moves speech up and out of our body. It helps us to sneeze. It helps us to cough. It helps us to speak. This is a really important element of our body, is this capacity to move things against the grain of peristalsis and push it up and out of our body. Anytime that you vomited, this is the ascending lung springing into action. It's the intelligence of your own body telling you that something's in here that shouldn't be, and we need to get rid of it. And then the ascending lung, the Gengyu lung, kicks into action and it pushes it out. These are intelligent features of the body. Our body is fundamentally intelligent. There's also the pervasive wind, the pervasive lung. This really lives in the heart and it radiates throughout the entire body. This is what's responsible for the circulation of blood throughout our system, going out from the heart and all the way out through the system to the lungs for oxygenation, and then, to be spread out eventually through the entire body. This is this pervasive wind. The fire accompanying wind is part of our digestive system. This is what separates out pure from impure components of the food that we eat. The pure components go to the liver to be metabolized into nourishment for the blood, where the impure elements end up going down and we eject it. We poop it out and we pee it out. This is the fire accompanying wind really facilitating the separation of pure and impure. And the final wind, or the final of the root winds, the essential winds, is the descending wind, the descending lung, the torso lung. And this is primarily located in the sort of bottom of our torso, of our abdomen, and it moves things down and out of the body. This is responsible for urination, defecation, ejaculation, menstruation, childbirth. All of these are functions of this torso lung springing into action and pushing things down and out of the body. So this is just an example of when we hear lung. You might hear as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, especially if you spend a lot of time around Tibetans, they'll tell you, oh, you're a bit lungy. I am phenomenally lungy, and it's immediately evident for any Tibetan especially, and they'll say, oh, you have a lot of lung. And this is an element of it, but lung is also the facilitator of so many physiological functions. It's also the engine of disease. When cancer metastasizes, this is considered to be a function of lung. This is lung spreading something throughout the body. Lung is really implicated in every single disease process. Infectious diseases spread through the body through this motility factor. Like I said, malignant tumors that metastasize are a function of this lung spreading through the body. Throwing up is, literally where our symptom and our, getting rid of the disease in the first place is on the back of lung. So lung is very important for us to understand on a physiological level, on a psychological level, and indeed even on a spiritual level. There's teachings in the tantric tradition, especially my favorite example of this is from Machik Lapdran, who is an 11th century yogini and mother and the matriarch of the Chud tradition. But she speaks about this lung as being the refining force that helps to refine our most subtle, most sort of pure essence from the food that we eat into the phenomena that produces spiritual liberation. This is a topic I wish I could talk about it. I'll talk about it in an event that I'll speak of in just a minute, but it's a really phenomenal way to bridge our gap, not just between body and mind, but between body, mind, and energy, body, mind, energy, and environment, and even all the way to spiritual liberation. Okay. So all of that said, the thing that I really want to talk about today is provocation. This is a topic that we really don't get a lot of teachings on in Buddhism, and yet it's something that is so integral and so essential to the Tibetan Buddhist and Tibetan cultural environment that I really think it's a grave disservice to not include it. Tibetan Buddhism is fundamentally animistic. This is something that we are, maybe you feel a little uncomfortable with that idea. Maybe you think, well, Bön is animistic, and maybe Tibetan Buddhism has certain elements of animism, but it's not animistic. It is in fact animistic, and I will qualify this by defining what animism is. Animism is fundamentally the belief that there are conscious, subjective, personal experiences that are taking place in the phenomenal world outside of humanity, outside of Homo sapiens, that we are not the only forms of life that have a conscious subjective experience, who are going through the awarenessing of being a living being. This is something that we know in Buddhism and in modern science is present in all animals to some degree. There's a little bit, the all animals, I suppose, is a bit of a stretch, but we know now objectively that many animals demonstrate qualities of conscious awareness that really we didn't totally expect to be there. Complicated decision making, complicated communication and social networks, behaviors that we've otherwise only really associated with advanced hominids. It's an incredible sort of world that we live in, with many different manifestations of conscious life. And the Buddha taught this. The Buddha taught this in his fundamental teachings on the 6 lokas. He explained that sentient beings are not just humans. They're also animals, they're pretas, they're beings in the hell realms, they're devas, and they're asuras. These are all different manifestations of sentient life. So we know, we can accept that, yeah, well, Buddhism is, we're very friendly to animals generally, because we believe that they are also sentient beings just like us, that they've been our mothers in a previous life, and we try to treat them well. So we have that down. But there's many other manifestations of life in our little biosphere of the planet Earth. We have plants, we have microbes, we have bacteria, we have viruses, we have fungi. We have many, many different manifestations of what are part of one giant family of biological life. Something that's incredibly interesting in the Tibetan Buddhist and Tibetan medical worldview is the idea of unseen beings. We've all encountered these. If you've been around Tibetan Buddhism for a while, then you've encountered beings like the Nagas or the Lu in Tibetan, the Sadak, the earth owner spirits. Maybe you've encountered the Mamos. Maybe you've encountered, the Tsen or the Gyalpos, or the Tsomen, or the Teorang. There's many, many, many different kinds of unseen beings in the Tibetan tradition, which are spoken about. Not just in the Tibetan tradition either, but in the very beginning era of Buddhism, in the oldest teachings of the Pali Canon, we can see a sensibility towards these beings of the unseen world. The Buddha himself, the most famous moment, the most famous motif in all of Buddhism, what is it? The earth is my witness. It's the image of the Buddha reaching down to the earth and sort of nudging her to acknowledge the work that he had done in his previous lifetimes, to prove that he was worthy of the attainment of liberation. This motif was personified in early Buddhism as an interaction between the Buddha and the goddess of the earth. Prithvi or Prithvi Devi, this goddess of the natural world, especially of the earth beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, the navel of the earth, according to Indian cosmology and Buddhist cosmology in particular. So that moment, in some of the texts, it isn't the Buddha who says, the earth is my witness. It's the goddess of the earth that reaches up and says, I am your witness. Go away, Mara. I am the witness. He doesn't need a teacher. I have been here the whole time. This is an intrinsic sense of animism. And even though the earth goddess, we might think, oh, well, she's just a concept. She's just, the sort of allegorical representation of the earth. But then he was sitting under a Bodhi tree. He was sitting under a fig tree, which was itself the abode of a Yakshini goddess. It was the abode of a tree spirit. It's expected that maybe the Bodhi tree itself was a shrine to a Yakshini goddess. And that's where he chose to take his seat. Throughout early Buddhist sutras and the different cosmological teachings to the Abhidharma, we can see an understanding that there are beings who are not human and are not animal, but they are still a part of our environment. In Tibetan Buddhism in particular, the Preta realm, which we call Yidak in Tibetan, this itself is divided into 2 categories. And this is very important for us to understand, and it helps to alleviate or sort of avoid a lot of misconceptions. And this divide exists between the pretas that exist in their own special realm, by themselves, generally in these sort of desert expanses amongst their own kind. And then there's another kind of preta which exists diffused throughout the universe, throughout at least the living earth. There's beings that inhabit our own landscapes. This is the Buddhist rationalization for why we can have local gods, local spirits, nagas beneath the earth, the sadak on the earth, the mamos flying through the sky. That's the reason that these different classes exist in Tibetan Buddhism. It's not because they're allegorical representations of evil. This isn't Christianity. That's not actually what's going on. It's understood that these are sentient beings just like us who are caught in samsara. They're caught in difficult experiences and difficult embodiments which lack bodies in many cases, and they're intrinsically tied to the natural world. So this understanding, when we think of it in Buddhism, we might think, yeah, but like, how should I really incorporate that? You know, I prefer to think of the dun and the dre and demons as these allegorical sorts of, concepts related to my mental afflictions. But when it comes to something like medicine, the acknowledgement of their actual relative existence is very important, because these same beings are connected to our personal experience of health as human beings, as Homo sapiens. One of the most important and relevant ways that this happens, according to our current circumstances, is infectious diseases and epidemics. It's understood in Tibetan medicine in the Four Tantras in a book called the Dunne Sowa, or the Treatment of Provocation Disorders. Yuthok explains very clearly that desecration of the natural world, especially in sensitive places, or nyensa in Tibetan, sensitive places or power places, can lead to outbreaks of epidemic diseases, can lead to specifically contagious infections that then hop from one person to another and can become out of control very easily. Yuthok explains that the various kinds of behaviors that lead to this are deforestation, mining rocks, digging into the earth, felling trees, poisoning water supplies, disturbing springs, air pollution, water pollution. These are all mentioned specifically in this 12th century text as things that we need to avoid if we want to avoid coming down with these really terrible and, tragic human epidemics. When we understand how epidemics really work, we start to see that this understanding is actually really, really profound. Viruses are intrinsically not destructive to their ecosystems. Viruses are, as a rule, not destructive to the ecosystems in which they exist. Viruses work as predators. They work together in groups in these accumulations of many viral cells as predators. They basically farm and feed off of their prey, but their goal is not to kill their prey. Their goal is to leech off of their nutrients and keep them alive for as long as possible. This is why we can assume that COVID-19, assuming that it directly came from bats to humans, which I was 100% sure of until not so long ago. And the fact that we have to actually question that at all is very scary. But realistically, it's likely from bats. Similar diseases come from these bat colonies. But the viruses weren't making the bats sick. They weren't killing them. They were feeding off of the bats. They were maintaining actually a degree of homeostasis within that ecological system for their own benefit. Where it becomes a problem is when outer beings, outer threats, other predators go into those environments and encroach upon the natural territories of the bats and their virus stewards. We're the ones that can get sick because we're not a part of their ecosystem. We are not a part of their community. We don't have these relationships with them, and they don't know how to be in our body without making us very ill and harming us. This is why we get really sick and the bats don't. This is a kind of defense mechanism, an intelligent and calculated defense mechanism, which can evade our most complex and sophisticated technology as human beings because they are manifestations of consciousness. This is a really radical idea. The idea that microbes, that plants could potentially themselves be the abode of consciousness, that there could be a lived experience of being a tree, of being the biological organism that takes in sensory data, that recalls memory, that communicates with other trees and other beings in order to affect their environment. The idea that that itself could be sentient is very, very radical, even in Buddhism, but ironically, not in modern science. And the thing that we do have in Tibetan Buddhism to bridge this gap is a complex and sophisticated system of animism. Understanding that when we relate with a tree, we are not just relating with this sort of dead matter. We're not just interacting with something that's purely motivated by instinct. That's just a biological computer that's doing this thing with no awareness of the thing that it's doing. According to Tibetan Buddhist beliefs, and according to Tibetan Buddhist cosmology, those places are inextricably linked to unseen beings. If we start to acknowledge that the fact that those unseen beings might simply be very small beings, or might be unseen beings in that they're unfamiliar to us, they don't look like animals, then I think we can come to a very different relationship with the natural world. And this relationship is essentially the core of what we need to move forward as a species. If we want to avoid something like COVID-19 in the future, if we want to avoid COVID 2022, if we want to avoid the next zoonotic infection, which is going to arise and is going to challenge us as a species and is going to put us right back to where we are right now, then we have to change our relationship with the natural world. I do not believe that we will ever do that if we don't develop stories and relational paradigms to be able to embed ourselves in that world. If we just perceive everything that's not human as being biological instinct and sort of natural computers, we're never going to see ourselves in that story. If we just restrict ourselves to humans and animals, we're never going to get the whole breadth of experience. We're not going to ever understand the kind of consciousness that could exist in a tree, or the kind of awareness that seems to manifest itself in a virus or in a bacterial colony. These realizations, if we can really bring them into our hearts, as opposed to just leaving them in our brains, if we can develop mythic and interrelational paradigms for contextualizing them, then it will change our behavior. Humans are fundamentally beings that are rooted in myth. The very existence of Zoom, the existence of Buddhism, the existence of the UK, the existence of societies, the existence of London, the existence of taxes, all of these are myths. All of these are myths. They are mythic structures that we have used to relate to one another. We've related to the concept of being Londoners in order to create this inner sense of, well, we're Londoners and we take care of each other. If you go to New York, there's a very strong sense of what it means to be a New Yorker. It's not a real, tangible reality. It's a myth. The United States, it's a myth. The Constitution of the United States, it's the sanctification and the codification of a myth. These are all mythic paradigms. This is how we feel. Humans, animals of really any kind, but hominids in particular, not hominids, simians in particular, the size of our natural social groups are usually directly linked to the size of our brains and the sort of breadth or the extent of our neural networks. This has been studied, it's been researched, and it's been corroborated by investigating many different animals and the size of their brains and the size of their social networks. And we found that humans naturally have an ability to form about 1 to 200 social relationships of any sort of meaning. But I live in a city of millions of people. We all live in places. We live with 8 billion other human beings, and it's much bigger than 100 people. And somehow we've organized societies of millions of humans, hundreds of millions of humans that cooperate, that share wealth, ideally in certain cases, that share resources, that take care of each other, that identify with each other as a part of our in-group. The only way we could do that is mythology. It's not facts, it's not figures, it's not data, it's not statistics, it's not real land masses that show the divisions between two countries. It's simply mythology. We have to embrace that if we want to move into the future with any kind of progressive grace. We need to really harness the power of myth and acknowledge that myth is not intrinsically fallacious. It's not intrinsically false. The myth of animism, the belief that there are other life forms who are having a personal experience that we relate to anytime we reach out to them. When we pluck a flower, we are creating a relationship with another life form that is experiencing that relationship on the other side. That in and of itself, we can think of it as a myth. We can think of it as primitive. We can think of it as being archaic. We can think of it as being anti-scientific, but it is in fact highly scientific. It's highly profound, and it can revolutionize the very way that we relate with the world around us. So this is something that I think we really need to start embracing as, for those of us that might identify as Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. There's a big difference between demons and spirits. And this is a point that actually Machik Lapchen really drives home in her teachings. When people asked her, this was really around the time that Yuthok was born, that she was giving this teaching, or maybe a few years preceding his birth. But someone asked her, they said, well, Machik, are these outer spirits, the Mamos and the Terang and the Gyalpos and the Nyen and the Tsen and the Sadak and so on, are these all the gods and demons? Are these absolute good and absolute bad? And she said, no, of course they're not. She said, there are no gods and demons that exist outside the space of your own mind. Your brain produces the gods and demons. Your mind produces the gods and demons. If someone helps you right now, your myopic relative worldview is going to tell you that that's a god. If they hurt you, even temporarily, then you're going to say, oh no, that's a demon. That's the paradigm that we use as human beings usually. When we go about our lives and say, I love you, you're a god. I hate you, you're a demon, you're the devil. This is what we're doing. We're creating dualism in our lived experience. She said, that's not what the spirits are. That's not what these other beings are. They're not your gods and demons. If you want to find the ultimate God, you need to find liberation from cyclic existence. There is no God other than that. If you want to find the ultimate demon, that's whatever hinders your experience of liberation. The essential definition of Mara, whatever hinders your experience of liberation, that is the real demon. So when we look at the Dharma, when we look at this inner science of liberating ourselves from cyclic existence, that's what we need to focus on. But if we want to figure out how to relate in a complex and diverse, biologically vast ecosystem, and if we want to do that as friendly neighbors to our other humans and our other animals and our other life forms, if we want to maintain, social health, if we want to maintain public health, then we need to really start to relate with those other beings, as our mothers, as our children. There's a reason that Chud isn't just a tradition of breaking through duality, breaking through the dualism of gods and demons. It's also a tradition of generosity. It's a tradition of going into the scary places, going into the forest, going into the charnel grounds, and offering love to the beings that we would otherwise perceive as being demonic and afflictive. Being the beings of the natural world, the elves and fairies of traditional English tradition, here in the British Isles, our elves and fairies of old, those are not gods and demons, and they're not allegories. They were the way that we could conceptualize a complex existence, a complex relationship within nature. It's a way that we could feel it in our bones on a deep mythic level, as opposed to just perceiving of it as an intellectual exercise or a list of data and statistics. So all of this goes to say that I don't think there's any surprise that our environmental movement is not doing so well. I don't think there's any surprise that humans as a whole have not been able to cross that gap between what we know to be true and what we feel to be real. We need to make that shift together. We need to be able to step into that more embodied existence of not only being in our own flesh and blood, not only being in our own physical body, but being within this much broader macrocosm of the natural world. So I hope that this exploration of these themes is interesting to you. I know that people probably have a lot of questions about it. And we'll be able to maybe address some of these in the panel that'll be taking place in a little bit. But that's really what I wanted to share with you guys. Essentially, you know, Tibetan medicine, really freaking cool, and I highly recommend it. I highly recommend receiving Tibetan medical therapies, but I really recommend studying Tibetan medicine. You know, there's 5 sciences in the ancient Indian and Tibetan university traditions, or the monastic institutions. You know, we have logic, we have language and linguistics, we have arts and crafts, essentially, you know, sort of making things, craftsmanship. And we have medicine, and then we have Ngöndön Rigpa. We have the science of inner knowledge, of inner meaning. We have inner science of Buddha Dharma. These are really, you know, they're not all the same. Medicine won't lead us to complete liberation, but it's very, very essential that we study it. And if you study medicine, you will understand so much of the scientific worldview of Buddhism, and you'll gain a much deeper appreciation, I think, for the profundity that it holds. You know, Buddhism isn't just valuable because it's the science of the mind and we can understand our psychology. That's not the only use of Buddhism. Our understanding of the natural world through Buddhism, through the lens of these great Buddhist scientists, really have a lot to offer. I genuinely believe that the way forward for us as a species is to adopt a kind of Buddhist sensibility in relation to the concept of animism, not perceiving everything as intrinsically materialistic, that it's all just that, you know, atoms come together and produce consciousness. That's not realistic, and that's not the way that we understand it from a Buddhist or a scientific perspective. But we can allow for the magic if we embrace an idea like animism. Magic doesn't mean that we don't know why something happens. It's just, it's engaging with it from a point of view of enchantment, from an openness to feel moved and to identify meaning within it, to relate to something in a deeply personal level, as opposed to just leaving it as some sort of an intellectual exercise. So I hope that this has done some of that for you, that you feel inspired, that you feel excited about this sort of, you know, new way of approaching the world. You know, maybe the next time you do song practice, or you offer a serkyam, or you know, even toss your offering bowl water out into nature, it might change your relationship with it a little bit. You know, maybe next time you're walking past a beautiful old ancient tree, take a moment to really consider, you know, what's it like to be that tree? You know, is there life? Is there conscious experience? Is there sentience somehow connected with this tree? You'll find, actually, I'll stop soon, but one last thing that's really fascinating is that any tree in the forest here, if you go to, you know, the Forest of Dean, or you go to an old growth forest in Britain, and you go to a tree, you just walk up to any average tree, that tree contains up to 2,000, 3,000 distinct life forms of many different classes. You have insects, you have mammals, you have birds, you have microbes, you have all kinds of different, you know, different beings, from up to 200 or 300 different distinct species. That one tree isn't even just, oh, well, it's a tree spirit, it's a living tree. It's a microcosm in and of itself. It's a whole city, a whole metropolis, and it itself may exhibit some degrees of conscious awareness. If you were to lift a little bit of soil from the forest floor, that single handful of soil contains more life forms than there are human beings on Earth. This, to me, is, you know, it's not actually that surprising, because we read, you know, works by the great Buddhist masters, and they explain a very similar phenomena when we look at humans versus unseen beings, or versus hell beings, or versus animals. We're outnumbered by a very long shot. And for us to think that our minuscule little example, our one species in the countless that have existed on this planet, is the center of the universe, is absurd. We need to break that open. We need to start to really feel the interconnectedness, embrace the stories, embrace the relationship, really try to feel it in your heart instead of just processing it in your brain. And if we can all do that, if we can inspire our friends to do that and our family to do that, if we can really live this, then I think we can finally make our way out of the ecological crisis in which we find ourselves.